Welcome to the happiest of Mondays because we are back with the new Religious Studies project season. Before we go any further, I'm Brianne Fallon, and with me we have
Dave McConeghy. Bri, it's our 10th season. Can you believe it?
I can hardly believe that it is our 10th season. We've done well over 300 episodes now, and we're going to start off this season a little bit differently, actually. We've decided to go a bit more thematic with each of the months. So tell us what the theme is for this month.
This month's theme is journeys, and we picked that because we were thinking about some of the religious holidays surrounding pilgrimage and some other things, but really what it has come for us is the journey of the podcast and the field of religious studies as we try to deal with some of the really big issues that our field has as its legacy. So as we ended last season talking about decolonizing religious studies with Mallory Nye, we're going to continue that journey from last time with this first episode of the season, Decolonizing Religious Studies and its layers of complicity with Natalie Avalos. It was a delight to record this. Take it away. My name is David McConeghy, and I'm delighted to be with Dr. Natalie Avalos today. Dr. Avalos is assistant professor in the Ethnic Studies Department at the University of Colorado Boulder, affiliated with the Center for Native American and Indigenous Studies, the Religious Studies Department, and the Tibet Himalaya Initiative. She's the author of numerous articles and book chapters on comparative indigeneities, critical indigenous pedagogy, and specifically decoloniality. Her manuscript on production is entitled The Metaphysics of Decoloniality, Transnational Indigeneities, and Religious Refusal, and it's our great pleasure to have her speaking today to continue the conversation that we ended last season with Mallory Nye about decolonizing religious studies. Dr. Avalos, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's so nice to be able to chat with you, especially about this pretty timely topic.
It is extremely timely. You and I are speaking on July 5th, just after President Trump has had a major incident at Mount Rushmore, where there were Native American protests to his presence there and all kinds of opinion pieces. And it really is just such a perfect moment for us to assert the importance of decolonizing religious studies. And so I think for listeners that this might be new to them, or they're relearning maybe what they learned in graduate school and trying to figure out its importance. Can you help us by explaining what decolonizing means to you and what decolonization means in the work that you do?
Yeah, so, this is a really complicated concept because it's floating around in multiple contexts. I think in the middle 20th century, it signaled a status project, one of sovereignty, where a former colonized nation becomes independent. But I think since that time, the term has been percolating in, nationalist movements in the 60s and 70s, and in particular in the US, women of color feminist circles, third world women of color literature. And it really can represent how one begins to undo colonization, whether that is in their community structures, whether that is in their own views of their own history, reclamation of their own history, reclamation of their own knowledges, those things that have been marginalized, stigmatized, pathologized through colonial orders and through colonial forms of knowledge production. And really, we could think that most knowledge production in the first world is colonial knowledge production. So the way that I started to understand it in my teens, really just kind of reading some of that literature, whether it was like Shuri Moraga, Bell Hooks, Gloria Anzaldúa, thinking about the ways in which those that have been colonized can come to know themselves again through a new lens, setting aside, interrogating, challenging the colonial conceptions that have been projected onto us, onto colonized peoples, right? And really re-articulating our worlds and in ourself in those worlds. And so decolonization has been now, critiqued as like, well, it's not just about decolonizing your mind, but the process of decolonizing your mind is critical because people have internalized colonial ideologies. They've internalized ideas about themselves that maybe they're less intelligent, less valuable, less capable, all these things. And so decolonization can mean interrogating those assumptions. It can mean, in the academy especially, rewriting our histories, challenging racist assumptions and ideologies, more specifically in Native American and Indigenous studies, really challenging the primitivist frameworks that had been used for decades to understand Indigenous peoples. So those are just some of the ways in which I understand decolonization, but really now we can think of it as a methodology and one that's been operating for decades, actually in religious studies, but in subfields like Native American and Indigenous studies, or, Indigenous religious traditions and the ways in which they overlap with the greater field of Native American and Indigenous studies. And so the subfield has some work that represents what it means to decolonize, but it's not understood so explicitly by the mainstream of religious studies, partly because the mainstream of religious studies has not really kept up with some of the changes happening in the social sciences or the humanities. Even when it came to the reflexive and post-structuralist turns, now in anthropology and other fields, we have the ontological turn, which is really understanding the ways in which multiple ontologies coexist, and that literature and scholarship can be done in different ways. They don't have to be centered through Western logics and epistemologies. And so the work of decolonization has essentially led us to this place. If it weren't for literature that started to come out 20 years ago on decolonization in an ethnic studies and an Indigenous studies context, we wouldn't have the ontological turn. But unfortunately, religious studies just hasn't engaged some of these new movements forward in scholarship.
I'm so pleased to hear the decentering that you're suggesting that our field needs. One of the elements of Chris Cotter's interview with Mallory Nye about decolonization that really struck me is how many of us in religious studies are so comfortable with deconstructing religion, but we're far less comfortable deconstructing the idea that the whole enterprise of religious studies, as it has been given to us from the academy and the way that it operates in the academy, is also a colonial structure. And I think Nye does a really good job tracing the European racist and colonial legacy of that. And one of the places where I'm so pleased that you pick back up is for those who have experienced the personal trauma of colonization and continue to live in colonial structures that are actively oppressing them and asking them to think and behave and work and live in colonialist structures, that it gives us a new way to really grasp onto the vitality of the field that has been there for a long time. If you had to identify the location of Indigenous studies in relation to religious studies as a field, and where do you think that effort of decolonization would locate them? Does it stand together with it? Does it confront religious studies?
So in the way that I was trained, so I was trained by Inez Talamantes, who was in some ways a major figure in Native American and Indigenous religious traditions, because part of what she was doing, the decolonial praxis of challenging the existing order of power within the academy that essentially had centered the work of white scholars on Indigenous peoples. And she was challenging the projections and misreadings and really misunderstandings that were present and continued to perpetuate. And so she started doing this in the 80s. And so I think that there's been a conversation, even thinking about like liberation theology, like womanist theology and Black theology, like we can see those as kind of proto-expressions of decolonial work. That part of the larger process, even if it hasn't been explicitly framed as decolonial work, is just, as you noted, is decentering this kind of assumption of like a white, objective, neutral voice, scholarly voice that can do legitimate work. In a lot of the critiques, and one of the reasons why I think these fields that do decolonial work have been so marginalized is because they're framed as being interested voices. So myself, I was trained in, like you, in religious studies. I wasn't trained in theology in any way, but I've received a lot of critiques that my work is theological. Why? Because I must have a biased position as a Chicana of Apache descent that's interested in trying to understand urban Indian religious life. Well, I can't possibly be neutral. And if I claim that I'm using Indigenous theory, well, that must mean that I am just taking the narratives and the word of my interlocutors at face value and not doing any real critical theoretical engagement. Part of what's missing there is that there's a complete misunderstanding or failure to understand that Indigenous theorists and scholars actually do exist and that you can draw from their work and use their work in a religious studies context to understand Indigenous religious traditions and Indigenous religious life.
I wonder if I could, do you think that this is comparable, and I know we don't often think of it this way, but do you think that's comparable to, if you're going to talk about European Christians and, Western Christians, then of course you're going to use Weber, and of course you're going to use Durkheim, and of course you're going to use Geertz, right? That is the culturally located expressions that speak to those traditions and about those traditions. But if you're going to speak about Indigenous traditions, well, what is Weber to them, right? What is Durkheim to them? Is that what you're getting at?
That there's a way in which these are understood to be really the only means from which you can cultivate and understand Indigenous peoples. And if that's true, and if that's right, or even, like Tyler's work, or, this kind of anthropological, really primitivist anthropological frameworks that you're expected to apply. And you just can't, because you realize it's violent to do,
supremely racist.
Well, and it just deeply disfigures. You don't end up learning anything about the Indigenous communities. You just end up learning about what you're projecting onto them. And so you're not really cultivating anything that's helpful to the communities or to the larger world of scholarship. It just becomes a kind of like navel gazing. Again, part of the work that decolonization can do in the greater field is to interrogate that assumed neutral position. And this is why it's important for us to understand the reflexive turn, right? That we are all interested. We are all speaking from an interested position, and that our positionalities frame what conversations we have and how we understand them and what we produce, what kind of knowledge we're producing. But also in an Indigenous studies context, the call has been, let's no longer do violence to Indigenous peoples and communities, especially in scholarship, because we understand that there's a direct relationship between knowledge production, because if we think of anthropology as really an extension of state policies that want to manage Indigenous populations in order to continue to have political control over them and exploit their resources and bodies, then we really have to think about the ways in which, we have to be careful to just think about how power is operating in knowledge production. And that's what a decolonial approach asks us to do, is to think deeply about that. How is it that knowledges are basically perceived to have a hierarchy, that there are some knowledges that are more important and legitimate and rational and valuable than others? All those deeply racialized, because if we think of racism is just a means to an end. Racism just operates to pathologize and silence those that are, then become exploitable. In the words of another decolonial scholar, Nelson Maldonado Torres, he would say, well, it compels slavability, right? Those that can be ultimately exploited, and it naturalizes their slavability and exploitability. And unfortunately, that's where we're at. We're in a place, not only socially, but in academia, where those hierarchies are so naturalized that what decolonial work does is it asks us to interrogate and deconstruct and challenge these naturalized assumptions so that we may do work that's actually just.
I think you're offering a lot here to those that would want to pursue this work. You present it in structural terms and you present it in personal terms, but I'm hearing also that there's a lot of psychological work that needs to happen for each person as they're involved in this. Can you speak a little bit more about maybe, and I know that this comes from Fritz Fanon and the kind of two ways of thinking about decolonization's work, but can you make the distinction a little bit clearer for listeners about the structural elements versus the psychological elements, and specifically because if we change the structural elements and we don't change the psychological ones, we're still not working towards justice, right? Because they're being retained. And so if we're engaged in both halves of that process, as you say that we should be, why do we want to do that work? And if we don't feel like we are positioned in a colonialist structure, why is that work still essential to us?
Yeah. Well, what I appreciate so much about Fanon's work, and, just to be clear, he was understood as an anti-colonial scholar. And that was like kind of mid 20th century expression of scholarship that was really seeking to totally deconstruct. And not that decolonization is not invested in the same aims. I think that there are shared aims, but decolonial scholarship, at least from the more Latin American strain of Mignolo, Quijano, they're pulling from both, critical theory, but also folks like Fanon and some of those middle 20th century thinkers. What I really appreciate about his work is that, he was a psychoanalyst. He was really trying to understand, well, how is it that colonization pathologizes the colonized? And how is it that the colonized internalize these ideas? We think in terms of Foucault's biopower,
right.
The ways in which we internalize the relations of power that essentially construct modernity. So Mignolo would say, well, modernity is coloniality, right? That all these relations of power are based on colonial logics. And so for Fanon, it was really important for him because it's one thing to say, okay, well, now we have autonomy. Structurally, we're autonomous, but are we still replicating the same systems of power? Are we still replicating the same hierarchies of power where we've so deeply internalized whiteness as the only option in how to function that we're still operating in a way that's aspirationally white, aspirationally European, as opposed to reevaluating, well, what might it mean? And I think this is the major conversation that's come out of ethnic studies and Native American and Indigenous studies. What does it mean for us to re-envision our social world using our own logics, our own philosophical logics, reclaiming them, and also recognizing the ones that still exist, that are still in operation? So that might mean looking at the ways in which we care for the land and plant and don't over harvest or don't damage the land and plant crops that are complementary to one another in a kind of very structural way. But also, what is your relationship to power, right? Like, how is it that we've internalized an idea that top-down power is the only possible way that a society can function, right?
Right.
And, luckily we get critiques of this, coming out of like women and gender studies and feminist studies about, well, what are some of the differences between hierarchical power and lateral power? But I think that that's what Fanon was really helping us get to, is the ways in which we have so deeply internalized these hierarchical, racist, white supremacist structures that were still often attenuated to them. And that, in a religious studies context, that means whose work is going to be perceived as legitimate and relevant and important and even viable, then who is getting a job. To me, the real boon of folks like Mallory and I and others wanting to take up this mantle and do this critique, because he notes that there are people in religious studies that have started to do, right? They've kind of done the proto version of this work, like Masazawa, helping us understand, well, these categories that we live with that have become naturalized, they're cultivated through these deeply colonialist motivations.
Right.
So why don't we deconstruct them and then reevaluate what position are we speaking from and what do we want to do and what kinds of hierarchies are we still implicated in and how do we extricate ourselves? Because I think part of the process, and I know this sounds very lofty, but part of the process and the end goal that I think even Fanon was leading us to is re-envisioning a world of lateral power and interdependent power, moving away from a reality that has to be, like this zero-sum game. So I think it really, in some ways, is a deeply personal, psychological, emotional, one could say even spiritual project. Like, this is really a project of personal liberation. How do we get free of structures that are binding all of us in ways that we're not really happy with, right? Because if we think that some of these hierarchical structures that currently benefit white male scholars, that they're perceived in the field as the most legitimate, as having the most accurate voices, even being the most valuable voices. What a burden on them, right? Like, it makes me think of the ways in which, say, patriarchy hurts men, right? We often think of the ways in which patriarchy just hurts like the non-binary in women, but that's not the case, right? So we can think that coloniality actually hurts all of us because it puts all of us, it creates a framework where we're all frozen in our racialized, gendered, sexed, classed positions. And it prevents us from being able to move around and redefine our relationships to one another, and redefine what's valuable in the field and what's important. And even, I think that there have been several scholars that have bemoaned the ways in which religious studies has become somewhat marginalized or less relevant. That religious studies students have now migrated to maybe American studies or other places. Well, how do you rebrand yourself, I guess, or make yourself relevant again? Well, talk about the things that matter. Talk about these power dynamics in ways that are legible and relevant. Because young people, they're smart. They know that these conversations can exist, but we're just not having them.
Yeah, it's such a frustrating moment where the promise of all of this seems so latent for us, but there are moments when we're not actualizing it to our greatest advantage.
Yeah.
I'm looking at your teaching document in the background because I love the way that you put some of the things that you were just mentioning. We hear the word decolonization often in resistance circles, but what does it mean? Some of you may dismiss it as irrelevant by thinking, quote, "I'm not a person of color. I haven't been affected or constrained by colonialism." Bad news, buddy. We are all affected and constrained by colonialism. And so I think you're very eloquent on this point about not simply the people for whom the oppression is direct and immediate and visible, but that the structures affect us all, and that we should all want to not just recognize them, but to work to limit their effects. When I was reading your work in preparing to speak, one of the things that really stood out for me about La Placita was the idea of regeneration. Do you think you could share a bit about regeneration as a theoretical concept that helps people experience the psychological benefits of decolonization?
The reason why I really like this concept, I'm drawing from a Mohawk scholar, Taki Alfred, and he's speaking in the context of different First Nations communities that he's worked with. And what he was trying to understand, he's a political scientist, and he was really trying to understand, well, how does Indigenous governance work? How can it actually be functional? Because Indigenous governance that has been modeled on like a nation state hierarchical template was never really functional, and they were essentially put in place to carry out the wishes of settler colonial, like resource extraction, things like that. So the settler colonial goals. And so traditional models of governance had been shifted to the side. And generally, traditional models of governance were religious leaders. So he was trying to understand, well, how is it that we can have functional governance? And he was saying, well, really it comes down to regeneration. It comes down to regenerating as peoples. And what he means by that is actually reclaiming languages, reclaiming your metaphysical world, reclaiming your sense of self as coextensive with others. And what I liked about it in terms of La Placita is that, I saw that that's what was happening there. And my interest in just trying to understand urban Indian life in general is that we typically I think, we have these assumptions that, well, urban Indians are just quote unquote less authentic. They're just not really they're going to have fractured religious lives. And to some degree, the religious lives are fractured. But that's assuming that there was some sort of coherent religious life pre-contact. And that's not necessarily the case. Like Indigenous religious life is really complex, and it doesn't operate in the ways that we assume religious life should, in this kind of like orderly institutional way. And really no religious tradition does, right? I was really interested in how it was that people were healing, really like healing from historical trauma, because that's such a deep trauma. Historical trauma is not just PTSD. It's really like a whole obliteration at the level of being. I was raised in a context where I saw so many people in my family, especially on my father's side. He's Chicano and Apache, and just seeing the ways in which what I now understand to be trauma was playing out. And so with La Placita, this is a community that's led by also a Chicano Apache man, Albino Garcia, and he was brought into the Sundance tradition, essentially adopted into that tradition. And he brought the Sundance and Sweat Lodge ceremonies into this space. And he was an ex-con himself, and he built up this community space to serve and support those that had been caught up in the criminal justice system, which, whether it was youth or adults, men, women, so former gang members, those that had been incarcerated for whatever reason. And what happens is that you become decontextualized from life, and then you're thrown back in. You come out of that space and you're thrown back into the world. And it's like, well, how do you reintegrate? And really what he found in the discussion there is that you're not just disoriented by the criminal justice system. You've been disoriented by colonialism for centuries, as have your ancestors. And so part of the goal is really reorienting yourself to an Indigenous world, but also to an Indigenous community. Literally just reconceptualizing yourself as a part of something larger. And I think part of what had been so psychologically harmful to people living an urban Indian life is that you really have no place. You're living in a space where you're living on your traditional lands, but you're essentially a refugee in your own traditional land, and you have no power, and you are dispossessed at every opportunity. And so how do you survive, right? How do you survive in a white supremacist environment? How do you survive mentally, emotionally, psychologically? And so regeneration helps us understand, well, what does survival look like? And survival looks like this deep reconnection, regeneration of community, regeneration of language logics, ceremonial logics, kinship, the recreation of family, rekindling your sense of, I talked to so many young men that were like, my heart was just frozen. And I was in deep grief, reconnecting with your emotional life and just the layers of generational grief around dispossession and hatred, feeling as if you were hated by the larger community. Then redefining yourself as someone that is a steward of the community, that wants to love and nurture the community, and that's actually your true identity and maybe even your true purpose. So that is profoundly healing for people. And I think ultimately a very good example of what decolonization does for people on the ground, what it really looks like, is that very deep transformation.
What I love about your work is that it's unequivocal that the work of decolonization is going to be different for each one of us. That the individuals that you worked with and that you saw working on the issues of decolonizing their community in Albuquerque, that for each one of us, Mallory and I working in Europe, me working in Massachusetts, you in Colorado, that in each of our circumstances, that's going to be a different kind of work.
Yeah.
As a white person, I receive privilege that I may not have earned. And the question is, what can I do with that privilege that I might not otherwise to advance these causes? Mm-hmm. If you and I are in the classroom and teaching on similar subjects about religious studies, what are the strategies? Do you and I get to use the same strategies? Do we have to use different strategies? If we turn here in the last few minutes of our time together, what can we recommend to those that are on board with the necessity and the long overdueness of decolonizing religious studies, what are the first steps that we might take that put us on the longer, lifelong process of doing this work for our students and for our field?
This is a great question. And I think this is one that people get stuck, because it's like, I understand this in theory, but then what does it look like? What does it look like in practice? And, I don't think there is any one perfect way. And what excites me so much about the fact that there are scholars, in particular white scholars, that want to talk about this, it's like, well, it puts it on the map as something relevant and important to do in the classroom, but also outside. So as scholars, I think we're trained to be neutral. And I think it is important to be somewhat neutral in the classroom, but we're totally interpellated by power, right? And so we have to name and visibilize that power. And so that's what in my mind, that's what it means to decolonize the classroom, especially the religious studies classroom. Think about the canon and not throw the canon away, but instead, how might I reframe the canon so that I can understand thinkers like Fraser, Tyler, Durkheim as cultivating a deeply primitivist discourse, and how that shapes our collective reality even now, right? And so in some ways, it's like an inversion, bringing in material like Masuzawa's work, Linda Tuway-Smith's work on decolonizing methodologies, really just helps you frame. So the conversation that you're starting with is interrogating power and these hierarchies that are created by the canon, and then unpacking that throughout, and then packing your own positionality. So how my positionality and sense of legitimacy and power in the classroom differ from yours, right? And be read differently. Well, ultimately, I think it's important for students to signal that for students. Just tell them outright, like, so I have this kind of privilege. You may perceive me as being more authoritative and more intelligent and more legitimate in my voice because of these structures embedded in the canon itself. And adding assignments that help deconstruct that. I have one on called Decolonial Autobiography, where I ask students to just think about, well, what are the layers? What are the colonial layers of the places that they grew up? Who were the first peoples there? When did settlers first come? Are the first people still there? What happened to them? What kind of relationship is there in that place with those first peoples? What is your relationship to power there? What is your complicity there? And that really carries out where, beyond the classroom, you're thinking about that. So here, decolonization, to speak to my earlier definition, is really also thinking about Indigenous sovereignty. When you're in a place like the US, where Indigenous nations still exist, yet they're totally erased and marginalized and silenced, especially within the classroom, how might we recenter them so that you think about your relationship with them, but also think about, well, what are the ways in which I can aid and support Indigenous sovereignty and be genuinely interested in Indigenous sovereignty? That necessitates a deep interrogation around your own access to power, what it means to monopolize power in the US and in other settler colonial nations. And what does it mean to share power? Like, just deeply reconceptualizing that. And talk about that, have a conversation with them. And just, that is the work. To me, that is decolonial work. It is really visibilizing what has been naturalized, these relations of power that have been so naturalized that we take for granted, interrogating them, challenging them, deconstructing them, reevaluating them, putting them out for discussion. That's a major part of the work, and helping students be reflexive about it, integrating assignments. I ask students to do like a decolonial autobiography oftentimes is, sometimes an extra credit assignment, but asking them to think about their relationship to land and place, because there's always some sort of Indigenous studies element in my class. Even, if it's a course on religion and healing or lived religions, I think it should always be there, because it really helps students understand and denaturalize their relationship, the assumption that the lands that they are on, particularly in the West, right, in the Americas,
Mm-hmm.
that these are Indigenous lands and that those Indigenous peoples are still there and they're still fighting for sovereignty. And that the more that we continue to ignore them, right, it's just making their fight more difficult. And so how might we rethink our relationship to lands and peoples and First Peoples and our layers of complicity in their dispossession? Honestly, what I find with students, they're pretty excited to do that, because they're so deeply uncomfortable with the complicity, but even more uncomfortable and frustrated and angry by what feels like an inability to do anything, to change structures.
Mm.
And I think part of the goal is helping students understand just how much power they have. They have an incredible amount of power, and that we all do, and that this is a collective effort. And so that if we're all contributing to this collective effort, we can have massive change. And we're seeing that now, right? In these movements where all of a sudden, like, statues coming down. Denver had statues of Columbus coming down. And Denver was one of the places that the American Indian movement had been working, even with like Italian American communities, to change Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples' Days for decades. A religious studies scholar, Tink Tinker, he'd been working on this. He's an Osage scholar, a leader in the urban Indian community there. And so decades of work is all of a sudden viable and possible in the blink of an eye. And I think that that's what decolonization work can do in the classroom. It just makes it viable and possible.
So in the classroom, let's tear down all those monuments.
There you go. And that's really what it is meant to do and can do. Yeah.
Well, I'm so thankful for your time today and for your expertise on this. We are delighted to be able to share some of these recommendations and your perspective on it. And we just want to thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much, David. I just appreciate that the podcast wants to have this conversation, and I hope that it continues to grow and build. So thank you. I appreciate it.
On a meta level, it was really amazing to continue the journey that we really started at the end of last season and have an additional voice in this discussion on decolonizing religion. Now, we're going to continue this theme of journeys through the month, but before we tell you what's coming up next week in terms of our theme of journeys, we have a few very exciting things to tell you. Now, the next thing that we want to tell you, I'm going to give to Dave because it was really his baby, and that is the new website.
Yeah, visit our new website. We're still at religiousstudiesproject.com, but it had been a couple of years since the site had gotten a makeover, and we were getting all these crashes in the back end, and no one wants the website down. So I took a big hammer to the project, and I redid the back end, and it's all bright and new and shiny. Suggestions are welcome. This is an open process. We're going to keep iterating on what it looks like and trying to make sure that all of the resources that we have, over 350 podcast episodes, over 330 responses, 500 plus author pages, and a lot of other stuff that we've done over the last 10 years. We want to make sure that all that is accessible and easy to get for all the teachers and the students that may be using our materials. And we're really committed to accessibility. So we're going back and trying to transcribe as many things as we can and really gussy everything up and polish it off for everyone to enjoy. And part of that process for us is also really increasing our attention to our media presence. Bree and fellow Ray Radford in Australia have been managing the Twitter and the Facebook, and they've been doing such a great job over the last year, really trying to build a community of social media presence. And we're going to continue that work. We have a newsletter that comes out with the opportunities that are generated each month that are sent to us that we share with everyone. And we're really looking forward to being able to continue developing the community that sees the Religious Studies Project as a resource and working on sharing all of that with you wonderful listeners. So if you'd like to support that work, we would really appreciate your visit to Patreon at patreon.com/projectrs. Even a small donation, a cup of coffee a month for us can make a big difference. We have hosting costs. We have website costs. We love to pay. Our interviewers and the transcriptions that are done are not cheap to do either. All of this takes money, and we would appreciate your help in trying to support this resource that we have pledged to keep open access and free for everybody who's working in higher ed to continue using.
So in addition to going and checking out Patreon, also follow us on our Facebook and our Twitter, the Religious Studies Project on Facebook and Project RS on Twitter. We love hearing from you. We love hearing what you think of the episodes, anything you see interesting out in the field. So make sure you're in a dialogue with us on our socials between all the different episodes. Now, we promised we would tell you what is going to be on next week, and this was one of mine. But Dave, why don't you announce it?
Sure. We are thrilled when people have success who are members of the project, and a founding member of the project, Christopher Cotter, has a brand new fancy shiny book that he has been working so hard on. It's so amazing. We're thrilled. And he got the chance to sit down with Bree. So next time we're going to be talking about developing a critical study of non-religion with Christopher Cotter by Breanne Fallon. I'm super excited. Are you excited, Bree?
Of course, I'm excited. It's always lovely to talk to Chris. And the episode is wonderful because not only does it talk about what's in the book, but the journey of creating the book as well. So it's touching on those themes on a lot of different levels. But until then, all that's left to say is thanks for listening.
The RSP is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions. The Religious Studies Project is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, SCIO, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation, charity number SC047750.
Brought to you by founders and editors-in-chief Chris Cotter and David Robertson, and managing editor Thomas J. Coleman III. Our features are edited by Marek Sullivan and Rebecca Barrett-Fox, and our Opportunities Digest by Ella Bock. Podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock, with audio editing by Gregory Schneider and Samuel Ward. Social media managed by Ray Radford, sales and marketing by Sammy Bishop, and video editing by Jonathan Tuckett.
Don't forget you can support the project by using our amazon.com, .co.uk and .ca links, or donating at patreon.com/projectrs, and you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, iTunes and other portals.